ask you, Kuba, when we talk about the modern history of Vietnam, where do you like to kind of think about? What do you think is the important background we need to know about Vietnam?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. And one reason why I suggested this topic was also because a great deal of coverage of Vietnamese history, especially in the United States, is through the prism of the Vietnam War.
Yep.
And generally speaking, um, it just turns into an Asian backdrop for American drama. Um, while
Baby boomer psychodrama. I mean,
exactly
my uncle fought in the war, so I'm used to it.
and it was a horrendous conflict for those
Mhm.
involved in it, and very dislocating and traumatizing for a lot of Americans, indeed. But um, of course, Vietnam has its own story and its own particularities that get washed out when you begin with the first GI's landing or the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Um, one one thing that I like to emphasize when talking about Vietnam from a deep historical perspective is that it is a uh, it presents itself contemporary Vietnam in ways very similar to the People's Republics of the Cold War era. That is, it is a socialist country, a socialist state, but also a nation state along traditional European lines, albeit with a number of recognized minorities. I think it may be. It's not quite the same level as China, um, but it's still more than you would expect. Um, there are about um, there are a number of groups that are recognized. 54 is the number. However, they only represent about 15% of the population. Less than that. A
I
little
think
less than 15.
54 is more than China, actually.
How many in China?
And well, there's levels in China too, so I should be careful about that. I know there's like the five nations, and then a bunch of subgroups, and I'd have to look it up.
56.
56. Okay.
Yes. The and so Vietnam again coming in second place to China. Um,
Oh, I heard some. You got yelled at by the PRC representative who keeps you on track. I see.
the she threw in 56 before I could look it up, but the headphones prevented me from getting solid intel the first time.
There you go.
That's my alibi. The so it is overwhelmingly uh, King people, which are what we consider ethnic Vietnamese. The other there's groups of Cambodians, Han Chinese, as well as a large number of mountain people, meaning different villages, communities, groups that live in relatively remote areas. A lot of them have um, co-ethnic communities in Laos and China as well. Um, but even the Vietnamese core is there's a stark cultural divide in the history between North and South. The northern area, meaning the Red River Delta around Hanoi, was originally a not originally, but um, one of the first uh, formal polities that emerged was in the Red River Delta, but it quickly came under Chinese influence, and there have been frequent attempts to incorporate it into China proper. There was a 1,000-year occupation
Mhm.
described from about the first century BC to um, around 1,000. The South, and it you can see the influence of
Yeah,
Chinese
no,
culture everywhere.
in the north of Vietnam, there's a lot of Chinese cultural influence, as well as you have communities from China, particularly Hakka people from
Mhm.
who are not actually the typical ethnic Hans, but are a group from southern China that are heavily integrated there. If people remember the Vietnamese boat people, many of those were people with ethnic connections to China who, when the People's Republic of China tried to invade Vietnam, they ended up leaving, as that invasion created certain pressures for groups that were seen as being tied to China. But of course, as Kuba points out, the south of Vietnam has less of a direct Chinese cultural influence, and it's important to remember that the Vietnamese language is a distinctive language related to the Asia Pacific languages, I believe, related to the Filipino and other not Filipino.
No.
You're thinking Austronesian languages,
Yeah.
Indonesian, Malay, Tagalog, the languages of the Philippines. The Vietnamese belongs to, I believe, the Sino-Burman group,
Right.
but it is it is not mutually intelligible with any dialect of Chinese, and
it has way more tones in it, for one thing, right?
It has more tones than Mandarin, certainly. And more tones than Cantonese, and more tones than Cantonese.
So you're up to like 8 then.
Yes, and I believe it is 8. Fewer tones than Thai, I believe.
Yeah, Thai's got a bunch.
It is an Austroasiatic language. There we go.
Austroasiatic.
Austroasiatic. So it is related to Khmer and various other languages in
that region, in what was once Indochina.
Indochina, exactly. And it has there are related languages in India, in parts of Burma, in parts of Malaysia as well. But the point is, it's a distinct language, even though it has a lot of influence in terms of vocabulary from Chinese as well. So the Vietnamese people, that there's a strong cultural tradition there that is distinct from China.
I would characterize it a little like the Korean Peninsula, where there's indigenous, pre-Sino, pre-Chinese influence elements. There's localities that local particularities and distinctions that have been, continually developed and innovated. But there is a very significant overlay of things like the original writing system in the north of Vietnam was Chinese characters, a very strong Confucian tradition. The north is also where Mahayana style Buddhism is practiced, whereas the south
is Theravada. I mean, Vietnam is the only country that I know of that has both indigenous Mahayana and Theravada native traditions that have to get along.
And the reason is that there were essentially 2 political centers that were stitched together. The north, which had this very long relation and conflictual, but also fruitful relationship with China. And that border between Vietnam and China was something much more porous and tenuous in the pre-modern period than it is now. And southern China, southern Vietnam, which was originally the sort of mother civilization in that region, was the Champa Kingdom, which was a Hindu-Buddhist Southeast Asian society. That one is much more closely related to the traditional cultures of Indonesia and Malaysia. At different points in the from 1000 to 1800, there was the incorporation of increasing sections of the South into polities that were centered in the North, and that led to the incorporation of the people living there into a Vietnamese national identity, as well as a large-scale migration of Vietnamese from the north to the areas opened up in the south. The South right now is one of the agricultural breadbaskets of the entire, on a planetary scale, a major exporter of rice all over Asia, all over the world. That development, while the area is fertile and well watered because of the Mekong Delta, it really took off once irrigation works, dams, and paddies had been built on that land, which for a long time had not only been contested militarily, making it difficult to settle, but also had the typical river delta problems of flooding, malaria, etc. Now, contemporary Vietnam is still somewhat polarized. There's a Hanoi center in the north where the capital is located, which was the capital of the communist People's Republic of Vietnam that eventually reunified the country, and Ho Chi Minh City in the south, formerly Saigon, which is significantly larger in terms of population, significantly richer, the site of most of the foreign investment and a lot of the economic growth that's been powering the Vietnamese economy. There's a uneasy coexistence between the two. The elite in the South, they were associated with the American occupation, and one reason why the city has taken on more of a commercial orientation is that if you were from the South, it was more difficult to get into the networks and establish the kind of relationship of trust and get your security bona fides to serve in the Vietnamese government in any major capacity.
So can I ask a little bit about that? Is it like I think we're going to use the Korean Peninsula a lot as our contrast point because I know it very well, and I think there's been a lot of American travelers there that can kind of understand the contrast point. But is it similar to like Chosun, Korea, where there was a division culturally even before it became geopolitically split? Is that also playing there? I mean, like, for example, and this may be the opposite of Vietnam, but in Korea, for example, the South was very Buddhist and the North was very, believe it or not, Christian. In fact, the Christians played a big role in the early communist movement there. And then they defected later. So is there a similar division there, or is that like artificial and being opposed by us after the war?
Well, there's a great deal of localism within Vietnam. We've only been talking about Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, but Vietnam has maybe a dozen medium-sized cities that have been the centers of small and medium-sized polities that have some legitimate claim to being a political center or a cultural center. Hue being one of the most obvious, but there's a number, and Vietnamese, similar to Chinese, similar to Koreans, they, even after migrating to big cities and sort of becoming residents there, still talk about their hometown, still talk about their family connections in that from that location, and it's consequential where you're from, and so that localism exists even beyond the North-South division, and the North-South divide. Some of it, there's significant cultural salience to that difference. I mean, the Mahayana Theravada division is alone.
And there's a kind of historical precedent to both the decentralized the multiple cultural centers that exist in Vietnam, but also the existence of a pan-Vietnamese identity. because if you look at the history of Vietnam, and Kuba probably knows this better than I do, you have this long period in which the core centers of northern Vietnam are um, under Chinese rule, but around the year 1000, you have the kind of restoration of a Vietnamese state. But this isn't a continuous state. There are various periods of decentralization. There are collapses, multiple kingdoms across this territory, and it's really only at the beginning of the 19th century that Vietnam is unified largely on the territorial basis that we know today. So there was the Great Viet State, which was a relatively new state in Southeast Asia, formed around the beginning of the 19th century, which basically brought most of what we think of as Vietnam under the control of a single monarchical regime. And it was this state that eventually came into conflict with the French Empire in the 1860s. Basically, Napoleon the Third, one of his projects was the conquest and colonization of Vietnam, although
there were antecedents to that going all the way back to Louis XVI. Jesuit missionaries were active in Southeast Asia. Not only in the South, there were populations of converts in northern urban centers as well. And one of the claimants for the Vietnamese imperial seat reached out to, in a moment of utter desperation, the French for subsidies and support in defeating the Tay Son rebellion. It was a bit of a bullet dodged because the French Revolution put the kibosh on any possible French intervention for this on behalf of their clients. But it's older than the official move towards French interference predates Napoleon the Third, is where I was going.
Yes.